The only way I could think of describing this game is insane. This game was played against Teimour Radjabov as white versus Alireza Firouzja as black in the Paris 2021 Blitz. And it is a Blitz game. There's a lot of back and forth here, but that means a lot of excitement too. And the way Firouzja approaches the opening is quite mind-blowing, really. Let's jump right in. Welcome to Chess Dog. My name is John Montgomery. Radjabov begins with d4, and Firouzja plays d5. Knight f3, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, and Firouzja plays dc4. And this is known as the Vienna variation, not to be confused with the Vienna opening after e4, e5, and then knight to c3. This is a defensive system against d4. It looks very similar to the Queen's Gambit Accepted, but unlike the Queen's Gambit Accepted, which tends to be more of an equalize first, try to win later opening, the Vienna variation gets very sharp very quickly. e4, playing for the full pawn center and attacking the pawn at c4 with the bishop. b5. The main move here is bishop to b4 to pin that knight and directly attack the pawn on e4. b5 defends that pawn. Now, obviously, that pawn can be taken, but if he takes that pawn, then the pawn at e4 would fall. So e5 first, knight d5, and now knight takes b5. And in order to hold on to that pawn at c4, black plays knight to b6. And then that knight holds on, and that limits the scope of this bishop at f1 for a bit. This is the idea. Knight goes back to c3, bishop to e7. This is the second most common move here, and Firouzja has a diabolical idea after bishop to e7. Really very modern, sharp chess. Bishop b2, knight c6, castles. Bishop to b7, placing the light-squared bishop on a very nice diagonal where it could cause a lot of trouble for white. Hits that g2 square, potentially. The main move is castling here, but Firouzja decides not to do that, and we'll see in a minute why. Bishop to e3, queen to d7. Now Firouzja can castle on either side of the board. He's got some flexibility there. Rook to c1, trying to apply some pressure to the pawn at c4. Now, here it comes. This is the novelty of the game, and whoa, what a novelty it is. g5. Really an aggressive move. After castling, which is the computer recommendation, the computers say black is equal. After g5, computers don't like this move. I'll just give it to you straight. They think that it's a mistake. But this is a blitz game, and the first time Radjabov has seen this move, almost certainly, it has not been played before or since. Bishop takes g5. Already not necessarily the most precise. Taking with the knight was probably better. Knight d4, queen d4, boom, boom, boom. And the computers certainly prefer white here. You'll notice black has a lot of pawn weaknesses and not a whole lot of dynamic compensation for those weaknesses. But after bishop to g5, rook to g8. And again, probably better was knight takes d4, bishop e7, knight f3, bishop f3, queen d1. And you have sort of an end game where black has dynamic compensation. The bishop and rook coordinate to attack the g2 pawn, but black still has those pawn weaknesses. Firouzja goes ahead and plays rook to g8 right off the bat. Bishop e7, knight e7. Again, computers prefer queen e7. But knight e7 unveils this bishop at b7, and maybe he can cause some trouble with that. Knight to e1. Now, illustrating how hard it is to maintain an advantage with white against an enterprising opponent who's engaged in original chess. The better idea here is to play either g3 to blunt the rook at g8 or b3, with the idea of just sort of opening up lines. And if cb3, bishop to b5, and then c6 would block the bishop at b7. But instead, Radjabov plays knight to e1, defending g2 with the knight, but it's passive. So now, Firouzja castles long, the most aggressive way to castle, and he has open lines of attack. The bishop goes to f3, challenging the bishop at b7. Firouzja goes ahead and takes the pawn at d4 with the queen. Bishop b7 check, king b7, queen f3 check, knight to c6. Now, Radjabov has an uncomfortable pin on that knight at c6 against the king. And knight to c2, hitting the queen at d4. Now, queen to d3 is what Firouzja played. Again, computers recommend queen to e5, just going ahead and grabbing that material. But queen to d3 is a very ambitious move. Obviously, he's threatening queen takes queen, and the queen could not be recaptured because of the pin on this g2 pawn. And if white captures, this is a very bad choice, because now this pawn that's at c4 moves to d3 and is very, very dangerous, and black would have an advantage in this position. So what white does, is to play knight to e3. And that way he avoids both of those threats. Knight to d5, and now knight to e4, aiming to fork the king and the queen on the c5 square. But this is an inexact move. A superior idea was rook c to d1, and Radjabov with white would actually be winning after this move, driving the queen away, say queen to g6, knight takes, and then just capturing on d5, threatening rook to b5 check, which would push the king away from the c6 knight that would be captured by the queen. So he's forced to take, and now there just aren't enough pieces left on the board for black to generate counterplay, and Radjabov would probably be winning against Firouzja in that case. But he plays knight to e4, the sharper move, threatening this fork on c5. Firouzja says, I'm not going to play defensively. I'm going to attack you since you've attacked me, and he puts his knight on d4, attacking the queen on f3. So knight to c5 check, forking. King to b6, Firouzja moves his king forward. He sees queens are going to be coming off the board, so he wants to use his king as an attacking piece, play more aggressively with his king. Queen takes knight, ed5, knight takes cd3, rook c to d1. And now it's very interesting how Firouzja is able to navigate the complications in the next 2 or 3 moves. Obviously, Radjabov is threatening to just take the pawn at d3, and, he'd just be better. So Firouzja first plays knight to f3 check. The knight cannot be captured at f3 because the pawn at g2 is still pinned, and then the king moves, knight takes e5. He takes that knight, and now the knight is defending the pawn on d3, and we can sort of assess this position. Black currently has an extra pawn, more space, and more aggressively placed pieces. His king is in a better position. But he does have a lot of pawn weaknesses. Almost every single pawn in black's position is weak, but black's rooks are better placed. So basically it's more active, better placed pieces versus pawn structure in this situation. So Radjabov plays f4. He wants to kick that knight at e5 away from the defense of the d3 pawn. Fair enough, but Firouzja doesn't run. He says, I'm going to counterattack d4, attacking the knight on e3, and he cannot take the knight on e5, because if he takes on e5, then after de3, those 2 pawns abreast on the 6th rank, that's the end of the game. Basically, Radjabov could resign in that case. They're too strong. So he plays knight to f5. Now knight to g4. The more accurate move, it turns out, was knight to c4, and then after rook d3, c5, king g1, rook ge8, and here black is better. He's well centralized. His rooks are well placed, and he would have been better in this position. But instead, he plays the knight to g4. Rook takes d3 and c5 in this way. h3, knight to f6, rook to c1. Radjabov wants to put pressure on those 2 pawns, the c pawn and d pawn. For black, knight to e4, threatening knight f2 check, forking the king and the rook. King h2 to move away from that potential fork. a5, gaining space on the queen side. And now Radjabov makes a fairly surprising mistake for a super grandmaster. He plays the move a3. A stronger move probably was g4, but he plays a3, and that allows a very thematic idea. Firouzja is able to play a4, and what that does is it sort of fixes a weakness here on the b3 square, and you have 1 pawn at a4 holding 2 pawns on the a file, on the b file. But Radjabov's idea apparently is to play b3 immediately and liquidate that pawn. But this concept does not work, because after a b3, rook b3 check, you'll see now Firouzja has these c and d pawns are passed. There are no pawns in their way. Only pieces can stop them, and that's a problem for Radjabov. King goes back to c7, a4, d3. Passed pawns must be pushed. knight to e3, rook to d4, which aims at the a4 pawn, a5, rook to a8, again pressuring that pawn, rook c to b1, he's threatening to come into b7 and check that king, rook to a7, a6, and knight to d6. He plays rook takes a6, rook b7 check, and this case, Firouzja is in great shape, because let's say he takes the pawn at h7, rook to a3 hits the knight at e3, trying to push it away from the defense of the queening square. After, say, knight c2, rook a to d3, knight to d4 check, cd4, and black is completely winning. If Radjabov played rook d1, the knight c3 would win in that case. So instead he plays rook to a6, excuse me, knight to d6 instead of rook to a6, rook to c3, hitting the c5 pawn, c4, so it's no longer attacked, rook to b4. So now white has 3 pieces clamping down on the c5 pawn. It's going to be lost, but hasn't he forgotten about something? Hasn't he forgotten about the pawn at d3, d2? Now, knight to c4. Radjabov makes a critical decision. He's going to let Firouzja queen this pawn. This is an endgame with tons of tactics. He's going to let Firouzja queen this pawn at d2 and hope that the 2 rooks and knight can generate enough tactical play against black's king that it will compensate even being down a queen. So Firouzja promotes to a queen. Knight to e5, check, king to d8. Now, black has a computer move here, and this is really an unbelievable move that you wouldn't expect someone to find over the board. It's really amazing. Actually, the best move here for Firouzja is rook to c4, giving up some of that material but reducing any of white's threats. Obviously, if rook takes, then you just take and decisive material advantage. If the knight takes, then queen to e1 hits, sort of tickles that rook at c3. After knight d6 check, king d6, black is winning here. He doesn't have enough time to take advantage. He just doesn't have enough material. But king to d8 is what Firouzja played. And now Radjabov has some real dangerous threats, real dangerous stuff. First, knight to c6 check, forks the king and both rooks, king to d7, and rook takes d4. So now the material is beginning to add up, and he hits the queen with tempo. For those counting, Radjabov has a rook and 2 pawns in exchange for the queen. The queen goes to a1, again hitting that c3 rook. But it turns out this is a mistake, believe it or not, and it requires a brilliancy to see how white wins this position. Now, he doesn't win this position, but a computer would win because of this unbelievably brilliant concept. Radjabov played rook d to d3 to defend the knight on c3, a reasonable move in appearance. But in fact, knight takes rook is the best idea. And after queen to c3, knight to b5 attacks the knight at d6 and the queen on c3. A less effective move, though playable at some level, rook to d6 check. And of course, if the king were to retake the rook, there would be a fork on b5. So he'd have to move away and rook to b6. And white would be better here with equal material, but still having a pawn that can queen. But knight to b5 would just have won on the spot. After queen to a5, rook to d6 check, king to e7, a7, and white, Radjabov, would just play rook c6, rook c8, and queen the pawn. And he would actually have been winning in that position. But that's obviously ridiculous to see in Blitz. You're not going to see that. So he plays rook d to d3, rook takes a6, and now Firouzja is winning. The material advantage is now going to begin to show. Knight to b8 check with a fork of king and rook, king to e6, knight a6, queen e6, and now it's 2 rooks and a pawn versus a queen and knight. Rook to e3 check, king to f6, rook to c5, knight to f5, hits the rook at e3, the knight's on a strong square, rook e to e5, threatening to take the knight with check, the knight moves to d4, rook to h5, aims at the h7 pawn, but now queen to e2, and the queen's really in Radjabov's position. He's threatening moves like queen to f2 and then maybe knight f3 check. But the knight can't be taken because of the pin, and then it would be queen g1 mate. So all kinds of threats now. King to g3, queen to e3, king to g4. Obviously, if king to h2, just queen to f4 check would be at the end. King to g4, knight to e6. Not as good as the best move, but still sufficient. The best move would be queen to e2 check, king g3, queen to e1, king g4, and then queen going to e4, hitting the pawn at g2. And if this case, king g3, knight e2, king f2, and then just taking the pawn at f4 would end the game. But Firouzja plays knight to e6, which does hit the rook at c5. Always a threat. Every move a threat, every time. Rook c to f5 check, king to g7, g3, and then queen to e1, and Radjabov resigned. The threats are just too great and the material too little. The actual slightly more accurate move here would actually have been queen to e2 check, which he would eventually have played anyway. And after king h4, knight to f8, threatening to play knight to g6, and that would be curtains. So a wild back-and-forth game from two elite players. Radjabov was 27-65. Firouzja was 27-59 when the game was played. Just amazing chess. I hope you've enjoyed this game. I think it's a real treat. Join us again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.